The America that plunged into World War II was a nation cleaved by a profound contradiction. Its leaders rallied a generation to fight for democracy abroad. At home, the virulent tenets of Jim Crow cast a long, suffocating shadow. This shadow fell particularly over its black citizens. This was not merely social prejudice, it was a meticulously constructed system. This system was rooted in the legacy of slavery. It was buttressed by pseudoscientific beliefs. These beliefs deemed black individuals inherently inferior. These insidious fictions were propagated through systemic underfunding of black schools. They were also supported by standardized tests. These tests were designed to measure cultural exposure rather than innate capability. Such fictions seeped into every institution, none more so than the U.S. enterprise military. Despite a long, undeniable history of black bravery on battlefields, this system persisted. Black Americans had fought from the Revolution to World War I. Yet, the military consistently sought to relegate them to subservience. It denied them leadership roles, adequate training, and the simple dignity of equal treatment. For young black men like Wilson Monk, the call to arms arrived amidst a life already shaped by struggle and resilience. He grew up in Atlantic City's vibrant but segregated North Side. His community, with its apex beauty colleges and bustling black-owned businesses, offered glimmers of aspiration. But Monk knew the sting of poverty. He knew the daily indignities of a world that deemed him second class. The Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 swept across the nation. It pulled millions into service. For Monk, it offered a complex mix of duty, fear, and a faint, flickering hope for change. Henry Parham, from the sharecropping fields of rural Virginia, also received his induction telegram. It was a reluctant step into an unknown future. They, along with countless others, were drawn into a military designed to reinforce racial hierarchies. It was not designed to dismantle them. Initial meetings between black leaders and President Roosevelt in September 1940 had offered a fragile promise of integration. This promise was quickly dashed. A War Department policy solidified segregation. It did this to appease powerful Southern Democrats. This happened even as the nation prepared for global conflict. This deeply ingrained racism meant that black soldiers were typically assigned to menial support roles. They were given substandard equipment. They were often commanded by white Southern officers whose hostility was palpable. Yet, as the war intensified, strategic needs for aerial defense became paramount. Military necessity began to collide with racial policy. The history of balloons, from whimsical early flights to their crucial role in military observation and defense, now took an unexpected turn. Their value had been fatally underestimated at Pearl Harbor. This tragic oversight demonstrated the cost of dismissal. But barrage balloons were quickly recognized as vital deterrents against enemy aircraft. These sentinels of the sky, with their lethal steel cables, became a critical component of Allied air defense. It was into this crucible of military necessity and racial prejudice that all black barrage balloon battalions were formed. This included the 320th. By late 1942, Camp Tyson, Tennessee, became an unlikely training ground. It was a sprawling, segregated cantonment. Thousands of black inductees arrived there. Revels sounding at 6:25 a.m. ushered in grueling 9-week training programs. These programs were designed to break them down. Then they would build them into skyfighters. Here, amid the chilling cold, recruits like Henry Parham, Arthur Guest, and George Robert Hamilton endured. Hamilton was a man of Cherokee and African heritage. They faced exhausting 25-mile hikes. They crawled through obstacle courses under simulated machine gun fire. They often bedded down in dog tents shared by 2 men and sometimes a snake. The heart of their mission, however, was the barrage balloon itself. On September 4, 1941, the first enormous barrage balloon was raised at Camp Tyson. It was a spectacular, if unwieldy, sight. The Afro-American newspaper described these as elephantine monstrosities of destruction. They were 900-pound, 90-foot long, 30-foot wide neoprene envelopes. They resembled elephants charging, with their shark-like fins and floppy lobes. Learning to skillfully jockey these silvery sausages was a scientific and intricate art. Colonel Leon Reed, the 320th's commanding officer, emphasized this. Ground crews wrestled with these bucking broncos in high winds. they learned to manage the static electricity. This electricity could knock you out if mooring lines were not properly grounded. A lightning strike once killed a winch operator, underscoring this danger. Yet, every day the dignity of mastering these vital military skills was undercut by constant pervasive racism. Malchi Adkins, like so many others, recalled experiencing racism during his training. It was a psychological toll that really hurt us. Wilson Monk observed how colored troops here don't seem to get along very well with the white officers and white civilians. He noted that nearby towns like Paris and Jackson, Tennessee, were off-limits to black soldiers. Insults like, "You niggers can't sleep in here," were a constant reminder of their place in the Jim Crow military. Mounting rage and frustration over these daily indignities and brutal conditions eventually boiled over. This led to incidents of unrest. A riot swept through Camp Tyson, weapons were locked, and a palpable tension filled the air. Arthur Guest, reflecting on his life as a black man from a rented farm in South Carolina, felt he was just above the slavery line. This sentiment resonated deeply amidst the indignities of their segregated training. It is against this backdrop of systemic racism, unyielding personal resilience, and the mastery of a crucial, often overlooked, military technology that the story of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion unfolds. This unit was the only African-American combat unit to land on D-Day. They would go on to perform heroic actions on the beaches of Normandy. Their contributions were tragically forgotten for decades. This occurred within the broader complex narrative of Jim Crow and World War II. The long, harrowing voyage across the North Atlantic had been a crucible for millions of American troops. It was a perilous dance with Hitler's U-boats. For the African-American soldiers aboard the Aquitania, the journey was tinged with a particularly bittersweet irony. Manhattan's skyline receded like a reluctant hand in a long and lingering farewell. The Statue of Liberty offered a poignant, if distant, reminder. It reminded them of freedoms they fought for abroad, but did not yet fully possess at home. The anticipation of combat mingled with the gnawing fear of a torpedo's sudden strike. But for many, the internal battle against systemic racism weighed heaviest. The arrival of American forces in Britain, under Operation Bolero, was met with a mixture of relief and curiosity. Britain, battered by the Blitz and isolated, desperately needed the morale boost. It also needed the material support the Americans brought. Initial British perceptions of the United States as a luxurious paradise were quickly shattered. They saw the stark reality of American racial practices. Captain Harry C. Butcher, General Eisenhower's naval aide, noted British ignorance of U.S. segregation conventions. He did this with a degree of bewilderment. This was not merely a cultural misunderstanding. It was the active exportation of Jim Crow. Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden feared this system. He believed it threatened to ignite racial tensions on British soil. It could also reverberate across the empire. Yet, for the men of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, Britain offered a profound, unexpected taste of freedom. They eventually settled in villages like Pontypool in Wales. Here, they found a society less rigidly bound by the racial hierarchies that defined America. British civilians often met the black GIs with open curiosity and genuine hospitality. Their government had advised them. It is not the policy of His Majesty's government that any discrimination as regards the treatment of coloured troops should be made by the British authorities. 8-year-old Barbara Dennett Holtham remembered the soldiers' generosity. They shared massive amounts of food, like tinned fruit and hams. These were scarce for British families. Medic Waverley Woodson befriended a local postmistress. He noted her confusion when American officers spoke ill of black soldiers. In these Welsh communities, colour was often forgotten. Soldiers accustomed to the ill will, harsh words, and artificial barriers of home were for the first time welcomed as brothers. The contrast with CO Lord water coolers and unwelcome signs back in the US was stark. It was a spark of a light that illuminated a different way of living. This unprecedented acceptance, however, ignited a fierce and often violent backlash from many white American soldiers. This was particularly true for those from the Jim Crow South. "Let us home, they think they're cute." One private fumed. The perceived threat of interracial relationships fueled their anger. The erosion of racial hierarchies also contributed. This led to frequent public confrontations, a British woman in Devon recalled. We got really scared they had so many fights. Locals often sided with black GIs against white MPs. One MC at a dance even announced the management wishes white American soldiers attending the dance to leave. This was due to their disruptive behavior. The depth of this prejudice was underscored by a fact. The anti-miscegenation laws fueling much of this white American anger would not be declared unconstitutional. This would not happen by the US and unexperienced Supreme Court until June 1967. The British public, media, and Parliament vehemently protested American military justice. The Sunday Pictorial asked, "What are we going to do about this?" They protested especially in high-profile cases like that of Leroy Henry. Henry was a black soldier sentenced to death for rape, despite compelling counter-testimony. This outcry created significant diplomatic tensions. It challenged American racial bias on an international stage. Amidst this simmering conflict, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt emerged as a crucial, tireless advocate for civil rights. She was described as the most loved and hated person in America. Her passionate missives frequently inundated Army Chief of Staff General Marshall. She warned, "The nation cannot expect the colored people to feel that the US is worth defending if they continue to be treated as they are being treated now." Her persistent pressure contributed to a War Department order in March 1944. This order was to equalize recreation facilities. It was a small but significant step. It was in this environment of both profound injustice and unexpected acceptance that the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion found moments of respite. They also found moments of cultural expression. One such moment was their New Year's Eve concert in Checkenden, England. Negro spirituals filled the air. It was a poignant testament to the human spirit amidst wartime deployment, but the psychological toll of constant racism and perceived betrayal was immense. Albert Grillette Wood, a black soldier, articulated the bitter frustration. "Discrimination hurt me more than anything in the world, and I had to fight for these sons of bitches." The mounting rage among troops, a patina of rage that had developed over time, occasionally erupted into acts of resistance. A report to the National Lawyers Guild captured the desperation. Most men have stated that if an officer or an MP draws any weapon upon them, or their wife or mother, they will have to die right on the spot. This was the internal battle these men fought. The external threat of Nazi Germany loomed even larger. The massive build-up to D-Day, codenamed Operation Overlord, proceeded under extreme secrecy. A palpable tension gripped the southern English coast. Soldiers were confined to sausages. These were jam-packed holding camps with crowded Nissan huts and tents. They were surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. This created a prison-like atmosphere with endless queues and no outside communication. The waiting was the hard part, as jittery men paced, chain-smoked, and imagined the combat ahead. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion was already facing equipment shortages and training delays. They were unaware of the extreme dangers that awaited them. Just 6 days before their scheduled landing, Exercise Tiger had taken place. This was a full-scale rehearsal at Slapton Sands. It had been ambushed by German E-boats. 2 landing ships were sunk. 750 servicemen were killed. The disaster was covered up. It was a grim secret. This meant the men of the 320th would sail for Normandy, blissfully ignorant. They did not know of the horrific prelude to the greatest invasion in history. The greatest invasion in history was a gamble. It was woven from meticulous planning, elaborate deception, and sheer desperation. Across the English Channel, Adolf Hitler's Atlantic Wall loomed. It was a formidable, if unfinished, barrier. It was designed to repel any Allied assault. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had dismissed it as an enormous bluff. Yet for the men poised to land, it was a terrifying, tangible threat. Allied planners, leveraging Operation Fortitude, had brilliantly convinced the German High Command. They also convinced Hitler himself. The true target was Pas de Calais. This strategic miscalculation was compounded by Erwin Rommel's ill-timed absence. He was celebrating his wife's birthday. This left German defences disorganized and slow to react when the real blow fell. The decision to launch on June 6, 1944, seized a narrow, fleeting weather window. It was agonizing for Eisenhower. But delay would have exposed the colossal invasion fleet. Yet, even the best-laid plans could falter. The pre-invasion aerial bombardment seemed like an awesome display of might. It was meant to soften the German strongpoints on Omaha Beach. It proved tragically ineffective. Low clouds and fears of friendly fire caused 329 bombers to overshoot their targets. Not one of their 13,000 bombs knocked out a single German gun. The thunderous concussions merely rattled the defenders within their concrete bunkers. This left them fully prepared to unleash hell on the landing troops. For the thousands of young men crammed into landing craft, the brutal truth of this failure would soon become horrifyingly clear. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, the English Channel churned under the weight of the largest armada ever assembled. For the men of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, packed into their landing craft, the 90-mile journey had been a misery of seasickness and dread. Medic Waverly Woodson Jr., despite the grim surroundings, found a fleeting moment of serene beauty. The eastern horizon blushed pink, but that serenity was a cruel prelude. When the ramps of the landing craft dropped at H.R. 6:30 a.m., Omaha Beach became an inferno. Machine guns, spitting 1,200 bullets a minute, scythed down soldiers. They were cut down before they even touched the water. Mortar shells rained down, setting ammunition ablaze. They turned the sea red with blood. The air, thick with the bitter tang of cordite and burning gasoline, vibrated. It vibrated with the incessant chatter of machine guns. It also vibrated with the sickening sip-sip, sip of bullets skipping across the sand. Bodies were blown to bits. Parts of men flew through the air. Others lay lifeless, strewn across the vast blood-stained beach. This was the shooting gallery war planners had feared. The 320th, an all-black support unit, found themselves thrust directly into its maw. Their landing craft, like Woodson's, were hammered by mines and shells. Corporal Bill Dabney plunged into waist-deep water. The smell of cordite assaulted him. He desperately clawed a foxhole in the fine golden sand. It was an act of sheer instinct. Sergeant George Davison lost a cherished gold cigarette holder to the chaos. He sought refuge behind a German bunker. His mind was fixated on survival. Henry Parham, ordered ashore at gunpoint, fought the overwhelming sea and the relentless fire. In this maelstrom, racial distinctions vanished in the face of shared terror. Waverly Woodson, injured by shrapnel when his LCT hit a mine, worked for 30 continuous hours. He tended to hundreds of wounded. He was oblivious to his own pain. He was a beacon of humanity amidst the carnage. Men like Colonel George Taylor saw the paralysis on the beach. He famously roared, "Get the hell off the beach. If you stay on, you're dead." He galvanized exhausted, terrified soldiers to push inland. On Utah Beach, the landings were less catastrophic, yet still fraught with danger. Willie Howard of the 320th noted the deafening noise and relentless fire. He also noted the desperate act of cutting balloons loose in the chaos. The initial moments were a test of raw courage. Every second was a fight for life. Every foot gained was an immense victory. Despite their designation as a support unit, the men of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion found themselves squarely on the front lines. Their mission was critical but perilous. Their babies, the sleek, silvery barrage balloons, were meant to form a vital aerial curtain. Their steel cables were a lethal deterrent to low-flying enemy aircraft. Private Cleveland Hayes of the 320th, with grim determinations, asserted, "If a Nazi bird nestles in my lines, he won't nestle nowhere else." But getting these silvery sausages airborne was a Herculean task. This was especially true under relentless enemy fire. The balloons, already likened to bucking broncos in training, became infinitely more difficult to manage. Bullets whizzed and shells exploded around the 3- and 4-man crews. They wrestled the massive 125-pound neoprene envelopes. They often did this with bloodied hands. They tried to secure the hand winches and replace pins. The planned 6,600 hydrogen cylinders were delayed or lost in the chaos. This forced improvisation and further exposed the crews. The first balloon finally flew over Omaha at 11:15 p.m. on D-Day itself. It was a defiant symbol in the beleaguered night. By dawn on June 7th, 12 more dotted the sky. It was a visible, if vulnerable, shield. Tragically, a pervasive and mistaken belief spread among some troops. They thought the balloons drew enemy fire. In the panic and confusion, many crews, including those on Utah Beach, cut their balloons loose. They sent them drifting away. This inadvertently undermined their own defensive potential. This decision, born of fear and immediate danger, highlighted the desperate, improvised nature of the battlefield. Even crucial assets could be sacrificed in the brutal calculus of survival. In the maelstrom of Omaha Beach, individual acts of bravery shone like defiant sparks. None were perhaps more profound than that of Medic Waverly Woodson, Jr. Wounded by shrapnel, he refused to stop. He worked for 30 continuous hours. He was a blur of motion amidst the wounded. He dragged 4 drowning British soldiers to safety from the churning surf. He revived them. Amidst the chaos, he taught other, less experienced medics life-saving techniques. He treated hundreds of wounded men, black and white alike. Their shared agony erased any racial divide. His tireless efforts were driven by an innate compassion. They were also driven by an unshakable sense of duty. They were a testament to exceptional courage. He was a force of healing against the tide of destruction. His records, tragically, would later go missing. This denied him the full recognition he deserved. But the lives he saved were his true medal. Similarly, when paralysis threatened to engulf the first waves, Colonel George Taylor of the 1st Division cut through the din of battle with a defiant roar. "Get the hell off the beach! If you stay on, you're dead." It was a brutal, direct command, but it shattered the stasis. It galvanized shattered units to push inland. It transformed a desperate holding action into a determined advance. His adaptability and leadership in an improvised battlefield situation were crucial. He pulled men from the jaws of despair and towards the slim hope of survival. One of the most critical, yet often overlooked, factors in the D-Day landings was the surprisingly anemic German air response. The once feared Luftwaffe was decimated. Years of Allied bombing of its airfields and industrial centers had taken their toll. It was overstretched by fighting on multiple fronts. It was plagued by poor decision-making from Hitler down. It was a shadow of its former self. Allied planes, flying an astonishing 14,000 missions on June 6th, alone utterly dominated the skies. Popular history often recounts a mythic 2-plane assault. But German records reveal a larger, though still pitiful, force. Up to 319 planes flew around 250 missions. Even the daring, almost suicidal, strafing run by German ace Joseph Pips Priller and his wingman was a singular act of defiance. It was not a coordinated attack. They flew in their Focke-Wulf FW-190s. As night fell on the beaches, the main threat came not from massed formations. It came from Bedcheck Charlie. These were lone German planes conducting nuisance raids. Willie 0005, Howard of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, vividly described the psychological toll. They'd light up the whole beach like a football stadium with flares. This constant, unnerving presence, the flares hanging in the black sky, cast eerie shadows. It maintained a profound psychological strain on the exhausted GIs huddled in their foxholes. This was true, even if the actual physical damage inflicted was minimal. The Barrage balloons, now flying with increasing numbers, forced these sporadic raiders to higher altitudes. This further blunted their already anemic effectiveness. Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, the Allied Air Chief, noted on June 7th, "They had a very easy run as far as the Luftwaffe is concerned." It was a testament to the collapse of German air power. It was a critical advantage for the Allied forces attempting to solidify their foothold. The initial foothold on Omaha Beach had been secured, but it came at an immense, almost unimaginable human cost. As the first brutal day faded into a cold, restless night, the beach was a landscape of utter devastation. Charred skeletons of tanks, trucks, and landing craft littered the sand. Twisted metal and shards of barbed wire jutted from the shingle. The air, once thick with the acrid smell of cordite, now carried the heavy scent of death and the damp earth. Exhausted GIs like George Davison huddled in foxholes ridden with fleas and ants. Their K-rations of pork loaf, sawdust-dried biscuits, and bitter chocolate offered little comfort. The moans of the wounded mingled with the distant din of Acker guns. It was a grim symphony of survival. Many who had survived the initial onslaught succumbed to cold and shock before morning. Wilson Monk, writing to his mother weeks later, could only describe the conditions as pretty hot. He noted he had not pulled off my clothes in nearly a week. The simple act of burying the stinking corpse of a bloated cow, as Sam Mattison recalled, became another grim duty. It was a duty in a world turned upside down. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, despite its losses, continued its vital work. James L. Simmons Jr. was killed on Omaha. They hauled their giant sea creatures through partially cleared minefields. They established a front door to the front line's defense. Eisenhower himself would later commend their courage and determination. The beachhead was a fragile toehold. It was bought with blood and unimaginable suffering, but it was a foothold nonetheless. It was the critical, agonizing first step in the long, brutal march towards the liberation of Europe. It was a testament to the profound resilience of the men who clawed their way ashore against overwhelming odds. The D-Day beachhead, clawed from the jaws of German defenses, was only the first brutal step. It was the start of the long march across Europe. For the men of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the fight continued. It shifted from the blood-soaked sand to the muddy fields and battered towns of France. Their babies, the silvery balloons, remained crucial aerial sentinels. They forced German planes to higher altitudes. They protected vital supply lines. As Allied forces pushed deeper into the continent, the 320th hauled their massive neoprene envelopes. They moved through partially cleared minefields. They established defensive curtains over newly secured territories. Their work was relentless. It was often under cloud cover and through the night. They operated with portable generators after initially borrowing hydrogen cylinders from RAF squadrons. "This is where we make our stand, or die trying," Colonel Reed, their commanding officer, had declared. This sentiment fueled their 140 days of continuous operation in France. This was before their eventual posting to the Pacific Theater. Their efforts, alongside vast logistical arteries, were indispensable to the Allied advance. This included the Red Ball Express. It was a lifeline of supplies. It was predominantly manned by three-quarters African-American troops from August to November 1944. Their contributions directly challenged the myth that only white soldiers were central to the success of D-Day and subsequent campaigns. Yet, even as they fought for freedom abroad, the insidious shadow of American racism followed them. The hypocrisy was starkest in the treatment of German prisoners of war. Over 400,000 Axis POWs were often afforded privileges beyond the Geneva Convention. They enjoyed Fritz Ritz camps. They even dined in segregated whites-only restaurants. Black American soldiers, however, were routinely denied basic dignities. Davis Kaysen Jr. and Tech. Sergeant Richard Carter vividly recounted being refused entry. They were refused entry to the same train station restaurants where American MPs and some of Hitler's bully boys dined together. They faced threats if they dared to enter. Wilson Monk, reflecting on the cordial, even backslapping, treatment afforded many German prisoners, could only shake his head. The memory was a bitter counterpoint to the racial terror he knew from childhood experiences with the KKK. But the desperate winter of 1944 brought an unexpected turning point. As the German offensive ripped through the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, the USA Army faced catastrophic manpower shortages. They made an unprecedented call. Over 2,000 black service troops volunteered for combat roles. They took demotions to serve as privates. They fought shoulder to shoulder with white soldiers for the first time since the Revolutionary War. This shared crucible of combat directly challenged decades of racial prejudice and military doctrine. "We ate together, slept together, fought together," one soldier recalled. There were no incidents. This profound experience on the frozen battlefields of Belgium and Luxembourg decisively debunked a myth. The myth was that racial integration would weaken fighting units. Instead, it proved that shared purpose forged an unbreakable bond. Despite these undeniable acts of heroism, the struggle for recognition remained profound. It was systematically undermined by pervasive racism. Within the awards system, Hollywood director John Ford observed a black soldier on D-Day. He was seemingly oblivious to the exploding shells, and relentless machine gun fire. Ford thought, "If anybody deserves a medal, that man does." The reality was a stark disparity. Waverly Woodson Jr.'s extraordinary 30 hours of life-saving work on Omaha Beach was recommended for the highest honors. It ultimately resulted in a belated Bronze Star. Its official presentation never even occurred at the time. This was not an isolated incident. First Lieutenant Theophile I.F. Levizo, another black officer in the 320th who landed on Utah Beach, was also recommended for a Bronze Star. It was an honor he, too, never received. Contemporary reports by war correspondents acknowledged the vital contributions of black troops, but they often framed their stories with patronizing undertones. They implied that the main problem is getting word back home of their status and work. This was a subtle but potent form of systemic erasure. It ensured their valor remained largely uncelebrated. The ultimate betrayal, however, awaited them at home. As the war concluded and troopships returned, the promise of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act was systematically undermined. This was the GI Bill. It was undermined for African American veterans. Roscoe Brown, a Tuskegee Airman, recalled the immediate reimposition of Jim Crow at the gangway. Blacks over here, whites over here. The economic and educational opportunities the GI Bill offered to white veterans were often denied to their black counterparts. Henry P. P.A. Hervey Jr., a Northwestern graduate and Tuskegee Airman, was told by Eastern Airlines, "We don't hire colored." This was despite his qualifications. It forced him into menial jobs. William Dabney was told he was overeducated to push a mop. He started his own flooring business. He sometimes hid his race from customers. Beulah Dabney, his wife, recounted the frustrating struggle to secure a home loan. She faced bank after bank without the necessary collateral. The collective dream of post-war prosperity, earned through unimaginable sacrifice, turned to ash for many. The personal cost of the war, too, continued to ripple through families. For Charlotte Simmons Chase, the news of her brother, James L., and he, Simmons Jr., killed on Omaha Beach, was etched forever in her memory. It was etched by her mother's cries. It was a profound and visceral reminder of the price paid amidst a society that denied their dignity. Even for those who returned, the struggle was constant. Veteran James Hardy Sims recalled the nasty Southern whites he encountered, yet he also recalled unexpected moments. White people would stop him to thank him for his service when he wore his World War II cap. It was a poignant illustration of a nation grappling with its own contradictions. The pervasive discrimination and violence, epitomized by the brutal blinding of uniformed Army Sergeant Isaac Woodard in February 1946, galvanized public opinion. It forced the federal government to confront its hypocrisy. Woodard's case deeply moved President Harry S. Truman. It shattered the myth that returning black soldiers would seamlessly reintegrate into a society that fully appreciated their service. It laid bare the continued prevalence of Jim Crow. It also highlighted the urgent need for change. The experiences and demands of these black veterans became a powerful catalyst for the burgeoning civil rights movement. Their wartime service, their exposure to a less segregated Europe, and their bitter disillusionment upon returning home instilled in them an unshakable determination to fight for full citizenship. African Americans clearly decided, "This is our country, we can't have black men fighting for democracy in Europe, and not have it here." Historian Walter B. Hill, Jr. observed, "This collective activism propelled landmark events. These included Brown v. Board of Education, Rosa Parks' courageous stand, and ultimately, the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. These began to dismantle the legal structures of segregation and disenfranchisement. President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948 officially ended racial segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces. It was a significant, albeit delayed, victory. The last all-black Army unit was dissolved in October 1954. Decades later, the nation finally began to reckon with its past. An independent Army inquiry in the 1990s confirmed what many had known for half a century. Pervasive racism was responsible for the lack of World War II Medals of Honor for African Americans. In 1997, President Bill Clinton posthumously awarded 7 Medals of Honor. He was attempting to rectify these historical injustices, yet the narrative contrast between wartime hardship and post-war recognition remained stark. Soldiers like Albert Grillet Wood endured the profound pain of discrimination, he asked, and I had to fight for these sons of bitches? Many years passed before any form of recognition arrived. For some, like William Dabney, Henry Parham, and Wilson Monk, it came not from their own country. It came from a grateful France. France bestowed upon them the Legion d'honneur. It was a poignant testament to enduring appreciation for their sacrifices. The story of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, and countless other black units and individuals, aims to carve a place in history for these forgotten heroes. It aims to ensure their sacrifices are not forgotten. For Wilson Monk, who dropped out of school at 14 to support his family, and navigated the daily indignities of Jim Crow with a multi-watt smile, the election of Barack Obama in 2008 represented a profound culmination of the struggle for equality. It symbolized progress and hope. It was a moment that, for many black veterans, finally brought their long, unbending battle for dignity and recognition full circle.